It began with a royal silence that shattered the palace corridors. As the world anticipated King Charles's peaceful transition of power, Buckingham Palace released a decree that stunned even the most seasoned courtiers. The king had forbidden Prince William from ascending the throne. But the true shock wasn't the rejection. It was the unexpected name written in gold ink as his successor, Princess Anne. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At precisely 7 o'clock in the morning, an emergency statement emerged from the palace press office. No one expected what followed. The carefully worded decree, issued under the sovereign's personal seal, confirmed that His Majesty King Charles III had made a historic and deeply controversial decision. The document declared that the king's eldest son, Prince William, would no longer ascend to the throne, not now, and perhaps not ever. For centuries, the line of succession had been sacred, unbroken, and unquestioned. But that morning, Britain woke to a rewritten monarchy. The decree cited breach of trust and moral hesitation, phrases heavy with meaning, yet hollow without explanation. Political analysts scrambled to interpret them, but the palace offered no clarification. News anchors hesitated, their voices trembling as they read the announcement live on air. The British people, fiercely loyal yet emotionally tethered to the legacy of Diana and the image of William as the future king, were left in shock. The disbelief quickly turned into anger, and the outrage spread like wildfire across the nation. Behind the grandeur of the palace walls, the staff whispered. Some claimed they had seen the decree being drafted weeks ago, sealed away in the king's private study at Balmoral. Others insisted that the king had grown increasingly distant, haunted by unseen pressures and fears that no one could name. Yet what caught everyone's attention was not merely the act of disinheritance, but the replacement of the one name that had always symbolized quiet strength and unwavering duty: Princess Anne. The document itself was unlike any in modern royal history. It bore the sovereign's golden signet, the personal mark of authority that only the reigning monarch may use. Insiders revealed that Charles's most trusted aide had hand-delivered it in the early hours, bypassing the usual channels of the Privy Council and leaving even the Prime Minister blindsided. It wasn't just a family decision. It was a royal coup, orchestrated by the king himself. As the news rippled through government offices and foreign embassies, confusion turned to alarm. Diplomats in London contacted their capitals, seeking clarity on what this meant for Britain's stability. Was the king still in full command of his faculties, or had illness and emotion clouded his judgment? None could say. What they did know was this: the monarchy was on the brink of its most explosive chapter since the abdication crisis of 1936. Outside the palace gates, the crowd became restless. Some waved banners calling for William's restoration. Others demanded transparency from Buckingham Palace. Journalists pressed royal spokespersons for answers, but each inquiry was met with the same polished line: the king's decision reflects the crown's commitment to continuity and stability. Yet there was nothing stable about this moment. In private chambers, the air was thick with fear and uncertainty. For those who had served the monarchy their entire lives, the unthinkable had happened. The very man sworn to protect it had defied tradition. Still, the deeper question lingered like a storm cloud over the kingdom. What had driven Charles to do it? Some believed it was a desperate bid to preserve the monarchy from what he saw as William's modernizing zeal. Others whispered of personal betrayal, a conflict too dark to reveal publicly. Whatever the reason, the decision marked a turning point, not just for the royal family, but for the very essence of the crown itself. A father had turned against his son, and in doing so, reignited the ghosts of history that Britain thought it had buried forever. The echo of that decree would soon unravel bonds of loyalty, love, and legacy that once seemed unbreakable. As Britain gasps in disbelief, one burning question echoes through every royal hall: what drove the king to turn against his own son in favor of his sister? The royal facade has long masked the storm brewing beneath a storm of betrayal, jealousy, and unspoken truths. For months, subtle gestures between Charles and William hinted at growing tension, What seemed like ordinary disagreements about royal duties now appear as signs of a deeper, irreversible fracture. A father questioning his heir's loyalty, and a son tired of walking in the shadow of a crown he no longer trusts. In public, their smiles were carefully choreographed, their exchanges polite and measured, but behind closed doors, the atmosphere had grown frigid. What was once a bond shaped by mutual respect and shared duty began to erode under the weight of conflicting visions for the future. Those close to the king say Charles had grown increasingly frustrated by William's insistence on reshaping the monarchy to fit the modern age. The prince, however, saw his father's rule as outdated and resistant to change. What began as a generational difference soon transformed into a war of ideologies where neither man was willing to yield. Their meetings, once warm and filled with familial understanding, became battlegrounds of pride and wounded legacy. Courtiers recalled the tension whenever the two men entered the same room, the strained pauses, the clipped tones, the avoidance of eye contact. It wasn't about small disagreements anymore, it was about control. Charles saw his son rushing toward power with an eagerness that frightened him, while William saw a father unwilling to let go, consumed by his own fear of irrelevance. In private moments, Charles accused his son of being too eager to rule, a remark that reportedly left William seething with anger. The heir, in turn, confided to close allies that his father was out of touch with what the people truly wanted. Adding fuel to the fire was the influence of Catherine, the Princess of Wales. Her growing prominence in the public eye and her modern, compassionate approach to royal duties began to outshine Charles's traditionalism. To many, she represented the future a softer, more relatable monarchy that connected with the people on a level Charles never could. Sources claim this unsettled the king. Some insiders whispered that Camilla herself warned Charles that William's ambition could soon overshadow his reign, suggesting that duty was no longer his son's priority. Whether the Queen's warning was driven by loyalty or fear, it deepened the king's distrust. What followed was a slow unraveling of whatever remained of their father-son bond. Conversations became confrontations. Respect gave way to resentment. The walls of Clarence House, once filled with family laughter, became witnesses to bitter arguments about the direction of the crown. During one particularly heated exchange, voices were raised so loudly that aides outside the study could hear every word. William demanded that his father step aside gracefully and allow the monarchy to evolve, while Charles fired back that his son lacked the patience and humility required to lead. The shouting match ended abruptly, with both men storming out in opposite directions, a symbolic fracture that mirrored the state of the monarchy itself. From that moment on, the relationship between the king and his heir never fully recovered. Charles retreated into silence, surrounded only by a few trusted advisors, and Anne, whose quiet loyalty began to mean more to him than ever before. William, meanwhile, grew colder, more distant, not rebellious, but resolute. He began preparing for a future he now doubted would ever come. The palace could feel the tension in the air, the shift in loyalty, the sense that something monumental was about to break. But this wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was the culmination of a power struggle rooted in bloodline, history, and the king's growing paranoia. While the world fixated on William and Charles, Princess Anne was quietly moving through the palace shadows, meeting confidants, attending private briefings, and advising the king in moments when even Camilla was absent. Insiders now reveal that Anne's loyalty and composure became Charles's emotional anchor, and perhaps the very reason she was chosen as the temporary regent to preserve what the king calls the integrity of the crown. As the monarchy trembled under the weight of its own scandal, Anne emerged as the silent force holding it together. Known for her relentless work ethic and unyielding devotion to royal duty, she became the figure Charles turned to when trust had evaporated elsewhere. Her calm, almost stoic demeanor masked a mind that understood the monarchy's pulse better than anyone. While others panicked, Anne strategized. She offered Charles the one thing no one else could: certainty. Her words carried the weight of both wisdom and warning, convincing the king that survival meant restraint, not surrender. And so, what the public saw as Charles's hesitation to abdicate was, in truth, Anne's invisible hand guiding him to delay his exit until the family's fractures were contained. Behind palace doors, meetings became more frequent, more secretive. Late at night, long after the palace lights dimmed, Charles and Anne met privately in Balmoral. The king, exhausted and distrustful of almost everyone around him, began confiding in his sister with an openness that startled even his closest aides. There, in whispered conversations that stretched until dawn, the siblings discussed the future of the monarchy in the face of internal rebellion. It was during one of these quiet councils that Anne is believed to have told him, "The crown must never appear uncertain, not even when it's broken." Those words became the foundation of the king's new decree, the one that named her regent. Her influence began to ripple through the royal court. Senior courtiers, long loyal to Charles, found themselves seeking Anne's counsel on matters once reserved for the king alone. She attended strategic meetings in his place, reviewed correspondence meant for the monarch, and even coordinated with key Commonwealth advisors to maintain stability. What had started as sisterly support had now evolved into shared rule, a co-regency in everything but name. Her decisiveness won respect, but it also bred quiet resentment. Some viewed her as a stabilizing presence. Others whispered she was quietly building her own legacy under the guise of loyalty. Yet, if Anne's ascension strengthened the king, it also unsettled Queen Camilla. For years, Camilla had occupied Charles's emotional world, but now she watched as Anne replaced her not romantically, but politically. Sources close to the Queen claim she was deeply uneasy with the king's growing dependence on his sister. She feared that Anne's growing control over Charles's inner circle was pushing her to the periphery, diminishing her influence at court. In private, Camilla confided to a friend, "She's turning the king against everyone who questions her judgment." Whether the words were born of jealousy or genuine concern, they revealed an undeniable truth. Anne's power was no longer symbolic. It was absolute. As rumors spread of Anne's midnight councils, her movements became the subject of intense speculation. Journalists began tracing her quiet visits to senior advisors and foreign diplomats, while insiders hinted that Anne had been preparing for this role for months long before the king's shocking decree. Some even suggested she had anticipated the coming storm between Charles and William and positioned herself as the monarchy's last line of defense. Whether by design or destiny, Anne had become indispensable to the king and the institution he led. But as Anne rose in the king's confidence, whispers began circulating. Not all within the palace approved of her ascension, especially those whose power hung in the balance. In the chaos of this royal earthquake, one woman's silence spoke volumes to Queen Camilla. Insiders claim she felt blindsided, betrayed by a husband who once promised her unwavering partnership. Behind closed doors, tears were replaced by fury as Camilla confronted Charles, demanding answers. For the first time, the Queen reportedly uttered the words, "You've chosen duty over love." It was a confrontation that shook the palace walls and ended in devastating silence. Camilla learned of the king's decree only moments before it was made public. The paper, freshly sealed with the sovereign's mark, had arrived at Clarence House under the guise of a confidential dispatch. But when her eyes fell upon the name written in bold gold ink, Anne's name, the world beneath her seemed to crumble. The man who once promised her equality within the crown had replaced her, not just emotionally, but politically. For years, she had been the steady presence beside him, the quiet queen who helped him weather scandal and skepticism. And now, with a single stroke of his pen, Charles had erased that bond from history's page. Witnesses described those minutes as electric. Camilla's first reaction wasn't disbelief. It was heartbreak, swiftly followed by rage. She confronted the king in their private quarters at Clarence House, demanding to know why she had been kept in the dark. Her voice, once measured and composed, trembled with betrayal. Charles, weary and defensive, offered only the justification that the monarchy cannot afford another scandal. He insisted that the decision was born from necessity, not a rejection of a move to protect the institution from the storm brewing around William's defiance and public dissent. But to Camilla, Those words were salt in a wound that could never heal. According to palace aides, the argument escalated into one of the most volatile confrontations in recent royal history. Charles defended Anne's appointment as an act of preservation, not preference. He accused the Queen of failing to understand the gravity of the moment, of seeing the crown as emotion rather than survival. But Camilla saw it differently. She saw betrayal disguised as duty. Her voice broke as she accused him of abandoning their shared promise, that they would rule side by side, no matter the cost. To her, this was not about monarchy or politics. It was about trust, shattered in the very home where it once thrived. When Charles invoked the idea that the crown must endure beyond sentiment, Camilla's fury turned cold. In that moment, she understood that the king she married had been replaced by a ruler consumed by legacy and fear. Those who witnessed the aftermath say she left the room pale and trembling, her crown suddenly feeling heavier than ever. That night, for the first time since becoming queen, Camilla refused to appear at an official dinner. Her absence spoke louder than any statement, the silent protest of a woman betrayed by both love and throne. In the days that followed, whispers began to circulate through palace corridors. Some said Camilla blamed William for poisoning the king's mind, manipulating him into believing that her presence weakened the monarchy's credibility. Others claimed she suspected Anne of exploiting Charles's fragile health to consolidate her own authority. Whatever the truth, one thing became clear. Camilla's confidence in her role had fractured beyond repair. Palace insiders quietly suggested she was considering stepping back from public duties, not out of defeat, but out of quiet defiance. Her retreat, they said, was her way of forcing the king to confront the emptiness left in her absence. It was no longer about appearances or royal duty. It was about self-preservation, the final act of a woman who had fought her entire life to be seen and was now being erased by the man she loved most. But while emotions erupted behind gilded doors, the true political aftershock was only beginning as the government and royal advisors questioned whether the king's mind was clear. Beneath the golden robes and royal seals lies a frail man haunted by time. Sources close to Buckingham Palace confirm that Charles's health has deteriorated faster than publicly admitted. Yet, the king's greatest fear isn't death. It's leaving the monarchy in the wrong hands. Doctors warn of cognitive decline, while courtiers whisper of emotional instability. Could the decree naming Anne as regent be the desperate act of a man fighting both illness and betrayal? Behind the grandeur of the throne, whispers of frailty had begun to echo through the palace corridors. Staff, who once described the king as composed and commanding, now spoke in hushed tones about his growing exhaustion and unpredictable moods. There were mornings when Charles would cancel briefings without notice, retreating into solitude for hours. Senior aides revealed that foreign physicians had been flown in discreetly to specialists, renowned for their expertise in degenerative conditions, to assess what insiders feared the king himself would not admit, that his mind was beginning to betray him. Those close to him insisted it wasn't just physical weakness that troubled the monarch. It was something deeper, a psychological torment born of guilt, legacy, and fear. The decree that placed Anne in a position of regency had not only shaken the royal family, but also the king's own conscience. He knew the world was watching, questioning his motives, doubting his judgment. In moments of solitude, Charles reportedly spoke of nightmares of crowns slipping, of history repeating itself, of losing control just as the monarchy needed strength the most. Princess Anne, ever the loyal sister, became his quiet guardian in these turbulent months. She accompanied him on secret health retreats in the Scottish Highlands and oversaw his private medical sessions, ensuring that no outsider could leak his condition to the press. Those trips were disguised as restorative breaks, but palace insiders confirmed that the king was undergoing intensive medical monitoring. It was during these secluded stays that Anne's authority deepened, and Charles's dependence on her solidified. She was no longer just his confidant, she was his protector, the stabilizing presence keeping his reign intact even as his body faltered. But the king's fragility did not go unnoticed by others. Rumors spread among staff of sudden emotional outbursts, moments of confusion followed by bursts of anger, sometimes directed at those closest to him. William, already on edge from the fallout of his father's decree, became increasingly anxious. He feared the king's decisions were no longer guided by reason, but by paranoia and fatigue. Privately, he voiced concerns that the monarchy's stability was being undermined not by politics, but by illness. Yet every time he tried to approach his father, the door was met with silence, and Anne standing guard on the other side. The more Charles clung to control, the clearer it became that control was slipping away. His once steady hand trembled as he signed documents. His speeches grew shorter, his tone more fragmented. Courtiers began to wonder whether the king's every move, especially his decision to appoint Anne, was an act of careful strategy or of desperation. Was he protecting the crown, or simply protecting himself from the son he no longer trusted? The line between leadership and fear had blurred beyond recognition, and within the palace, loyalty had become a matter of survival. For the first time in his reign, Charles seemed to be at war not with the public or parliament, but with his own mind. And as the whispers grew louder, the nation began to see what the royal family had been trying to hide. Behind the regal composure stood a man wrestling with decline, terrified that his greatest legacy might also become his greatest mistake. And just as the nation began to worry for the king's well-being, another shocking twist surfaced. A document hidden deep within Windsor's archives that could change everything. Buried beneath decades of royal archives, a sealed letter from the late Queen Elizabeth II has reportedly resurfaced. Dated years before her passing, it outlines her final recommendations for succession, a chilling prophecy that now seems to mirror Charles's decree. The letter names Anne as the guardian of royal tradition, should the crown ever fall into uncertainty. Was Charles merely honoring his mother's hidden will, or using it to justify his shocking betrayal? The revelation sent shockwaves through the palace. It began when an archivist conducting a routine audit within Windsor Castle's private vault stumbled upon a velvet-bound envelope marked with the Queen's personal insignia, the royal cipher, ER2. Inside lay a document written in the late monarch's unmistakable handwriting, sealed and dated nearly a decade before her passing. The contents, initially reviewed only by senior palace officials, spoke of the Queen's deep concern about the future of the monarchy. She expressed her fear that the institution might, one day, face an age of moral doubt and generational fracture. Her words now seem prophetic, eerily foreshadowing the chaos engulfing the royal family today. What made the letter truly extraordinary, however, was not its tone of forewarning, it was its clarity of instruction. The Queen had named her daughter, Princess Anne, as the one to safeguard the integrity of the crown if stability were ever threatened. The document did not use the term regent, but its meaning was unmistakable. Anne was to serve as the protector of royal continuity, the figure of balance in a time of division. To some, this discovery explained everything about King Charles's sudden and controversial decision. It wasn't a rebellion against tradition, it was the fulfillment of his mother's final wish. Those closest to the archive confirmed the letter had never been published. It had been deliberately withheld from the official record, sealed under what palace historians described as a confidential family clause. Only a handful of individuals, including the late Queen's private secretary, had known of its existence. Yet somehow, it had resurfaced at the very moment the monarchy was spiraling into turmoil. Some say Anne herself uncovered it during a discreet review of the archives shortly after Charles's health began to decline. Others believe it was the king who ordered the vaults re-examined, perhaps in search of moral validation for the choice he had already made. Whatever the truth, the letter quickly became Charles's private scripture, the divine endorsement he needed to justify his unprecedented decree. Those within his circle claim that after reading it, the king grew almost serene, convinced he was acting in accordance with his mother's will. He began quoting lines from the Testament during private audiences, particularly the one that read, "The crown belongs to duty, not to desire." To him, it was proof that destiny itself had chosen Anne to protect the monarchy when bloodline and politics collided. But for William, this discovery was not a sign of divine order. It was a betrayal written from beyond the grave. The letter that elevated his aunt also condemned his vision of a modern monarchy. The Queen's veiled references to modernist tendencies and public appeasement over principle mirrored everything Charles had accused William of. It was as if the late monarch had sided with tradition over progress, with preservation over evolution. To the public, the revelation of the Hidden Testament deepened the mystery. Was it coincidence or orchestration that it appeared precisely when Charles's decisions were under fire? Some analysts whispered that the king may have used it as leverage, not legacy, a weapon to silence critics and justify his defiance. But within the palace, one truth became undeniable. The Queen's words, whether divine or manipulated, had altered the course of royal destiny. But if the Queen's ghostly words inspired the king's action, William saw them as the ultimate betrayal, a rewriting of royal destiny he refused to accept. When the crown slipped from his grasp, William didn't bow. He fought back. Behind the palace gates, he launched a quiet counter-offensive, rallying key supporters from within the royal household and parliament alike. But through the storm, it was Catherine's unshaken composure that held their world together. Her silent grace became the face of quiet rebellion, the woman the public still saw as Britain's true future queen. The shock of his father's decree had left William devastated, but not defeated. What began as disbelief quickly hardened into resolve. For the first time in his life, he no longer saw himself as merely the heir apparent, but as a man robbed of his birthright, and he was determined to reclaim it, not with fury, but with precision. The once dutiful prince began to move with quiet intent, reaching out to allies within the palace who shared his vision of a modern monarchy. Trusted aides, sympathetic courtiers, and even political figures within Parliament were drawn into his confidence. Each conversation was measured, every word calculated. If Charles had chosen to freeze him out, William would find a way to thaw the walls of isolation from the inside. But amid the turmoil, it was Catherine who became the anchor holding their fractured world together. While William burned with restrained defiance, she radiated calm, the kind of stillness that speaks louder than words. Behind the scenes, she began to convene discreet meetings with trusted members of the royal foundation, ensuring that their charitable initiatives continued seamlessly despite the family divide. Every public appearance became an act of subtle resistance. Her poise, her composure, her refusal to show resentment, all of it reinforced the public's image of her as the nation's moral compass. In a time when the monarchy seemed fractured beyond repair, Catherine embodied its hope. The people noticed. Public sympathy swung decisively in favor of the Prince and Princess of Wales. Polls began to shift, headlines softened, and commentators across the world began to question the king's judgment. Crowds gathered outside Kensington Palace, leaving flowers and messages of support, not of mourning, but of loyalty. They saw in William and Catherine a reflection of the monarchy they wanted: compassionate, modern, and united. Even as the king's decree stood firm, the hearts of the people crowned them in spirit. Within the palace, tension grew unbearable. William's allies began leaking subtle hints to the press, whispers that the prince was preparing to address the nation. Though he made no official statement, every silence felt deliberate, every pause pregnant with meaning. Royal correspondents claimed that a carefully crafted speech was being written, one that would expose not his anger, but his conviction. It would not attack the king, it would defend the crown from what William saw as its greatest danger: internal decay. But before the statement could surface, the palace machinery tightened. Access was restricted. Invitations were revoked. The royal hierarchy, once open to collaboration, became a fortress of secrecy. Anne, ever composed, refused to comment publicly. Her silence was both shield and sword, protecting her brother, but distancing herself from the storm. Those close to her revealed that she spent long hours mediating between father and son, yet her loyalty to the king never wavered. She understood William's pain, but she also saw the bigger picture, the peril of division spilling into public view. Her restraint only deepened the mystery surrounding her, turning her into both a target of scrutiny and a symbol of stability. Meanwhile, Charles retreated further into solitude, shutting down communication with his son entirely. Letters went unanswered, calls ignored, and aides dismissed for questioning the royal silence. The king, once seen as introspective, now appeared unreachable. It was as though the throne had swallowed the man who sat upon it, leaving behind only the weight of the crown and the echo of decisions that could never be undone. William, undeterred, continued his quiet resistance. He no longer sought permission, he sought purpose. The rift between father and son had become irreversible, but within that fracture, William found something his father had lost: clarity. He realized that the monarchy's survival would not depend on inheritance, but on integrity. And as he stood before a nation divided between loyalty and doubt, one truth began to crystallize in his mind. The fight was no longer about a crown, it was about what it meant to be worthy of it. Yet, as William's defiance grew stronger, the monarchy's foundation began to tremble, and Anne found herself facing an impossible choice between family and throne. The palace had begun quiet preparations for Anne's symbolic regency, an unprecedented ceremony that would crown a sister in place of a son. But what unfolded behind those chapel doors was not unity, but collapse. Hours before the announcement, a palace insider leaked everything to the press, igniting chaos. Streets flooded with protesters, demanding the king's abdication, and the once proud monarchy stood at the edge of ruin. The plan had been meticulous, shrouded in secrecy, designed to restore confidence in a monarchy torn apart by division. Only a select circle of senior courtiers and clerics knew that a regency ceremony was to take place within days, a moment where Princess Anne would be officially declared the guardian of the crown. The wording was carefully chosen, avoiding the word coronation, but everyone within the palace knew its meaning. It was a transfer of power, subtle yet undeniable, the king's quiet admission that the reign of his son had ended before it ever began. But secrecy has always been the monarchy's fragile armor. The details of the ceremony, the date, the chapel, even the oath Anne would take, somehow found their way into the hands of a veteran royal correspondent. Within hours, headlines exploded across every British paper. Anne to be crowned regent, William pushed aside forever. What had been planned as a controlled, dignified transition became a storm of national outrage. Television pundits called it a betrayal of bloodline. Politicians scrambled to distance themselves from the palace. The public, already weary of the crown's internal battles, saw this as the breaking point. By midday, the streets around Buckingham Palace were flooded with furious protesters. They carried banners declaring, "Long live William," and "Not my regent." The chants grew louder as the hours passed, echoing through the heart of London. For many, this wasn't just about succession, it was about trust. A king who had defied his son, a sister who had accepted the crown, and a family that seemed to have forgotten the very people they claimed to serve. The monarchy, once the symbol of endurance, now looked fragile, cornered, and utterly divided. Inside the palace, chaos reigned. Camilla, humiliated by the mounting scandal, withdrew from public life entirely. Sources revealed that she refused to leave her private residence, unable to face the fury of a nation that now blamed her for everything from the family rift to the king's decline. Her name was whispered with resentment in the corridors of power, and even loyal staff began to quietly resign. Meanwhile, William the heir, who had been denied, acted swiftly. Reports surfaced that he had met privately with the Prime Minister, a conversation that sources described as calm but consequential. Though no official statement was issued, one thing was clear: the monarchy had lost control of its own narrative. As the world watched, pressure on the king mounted. Councillors begged him to cancel the ceremony before the monarchy imploded completely. The archbishop, fearing public backlash, hesitated to proceed. And then, at the 11th hour, Charles made his final decision. He called the entire event off, issuing a short statement citing divine reconsideration. He claimed that God himself had guided him to pause to reflect before taking irreversible steps, but few believed this was divine will. Most saw it for what it was: a desperate retreat, an admission that even the king's authority had limits when faced with the wrath of his people. Yet the cancellation brought no relief, no redemption. The trust that had once bound the monarch and nation had been severed. What remained was suspicion, bitterness, and a lingering question of legitimacy. The ceremony that never happened became a symbol in itself, a portrait of a monarchy that could no longer decide its own fate. The crown, once radiant with certainty, now trembled in the shadow of rebellion and regret. But for a monarchy already fractured, the cancellation didn't bring peace. It marked the beginning of its darkest hour. In his final days as reigning monarch, King Charles penned one last letter, not for his courtiers, nor for Parliament, but for his children. The words, sealed in grief, confessed his deepest regret, that power had cost him love, and fear had stolen his judgment. As the nation mourned the end of an era, Anne quietly stepped back, and William prepared not to claim the throne, but to rebuild the monarchy's soul. The letter arrived without ceremony, hand-delivered to Anne and William in the early morning light. It was written in the king's familiar, steady script, though his words carried the tremor of a man who had finally seen the wreckage his decisions had left behind. Within its pages, Charles poured out his heart, stripped of title, stripped of defense. He began by acknowledging the pain his decree had caused, not only to his family but to the very institution he had sworn to protect. "I feared the world's noise more than my own conscience," he wrote, "and in that fear, I betrayed both of you." It was not the voice of a monarch seeking forgiveness. It was the voice of a father desperate to make peace with his own humanity. To Anne, he offered both gratitude and apology. He called her the crown's unbroken pillar, the sister who had held him upright when the weight of leadership had nearly crushed him. Yet even to her, he admitted the heavy truth that his faith in her loyalty had been born not only from admiration, but from fear. "I could not trust my own son," he confessed, "and so I turned to the one soul I knew would never turn away." The words devastated Anne, for she understood what he could not say aloud, that his choice had cost him the love of the very child he sought to protect the throne from. For all her strength and restraint, the realization pierced her in silence. William's letter was even more painful to read. In it, Charles abandoned the royal tone entirely and spoke as a man stripped of grandeur. "I thought I was preserving your future by denying it," he wrote, "but all I preserved was my own fear of losing control." The admission that he had doubted his son's loyalty, that he had allowed paranoia to replace love, shattered what little distance remained between them. For William, it was not vindication but tragedy, a realization that his father's betrayal had not been rooted in cruelty, but in frailty. The letter ended with the haunting line, "History repeats itself only when hearts refuse to change. Let mine be the last to close too soon." Anne's response was quiet but resolute. She vowed to honor her father's final wish to protect the crown until William's time truly came. Those close to her say she immediately stepped back from public life, ensuring that her role as regent would end in silence rather than ceremony. It was a gesture both noble and heartbreaking, a final act of devotion from the sister who had sacrificed her peace for the kingdom's survival. Catherine, too, played her part in the quiet healing. She issued a rare statement of grace, offering public forgiveness to the late king and calling for unity in his memory. Her words, "Let compassion outlive conflict," became the echo of a new beginning. And so Britain stood still as the family, once divided by power and pride, stood together one last time. There were no grand speeches, no succession declarations, only the stillness of understanding, the kind that follows years of noise and hurt. As Charles was laid to rest, the nation grieved not only a monarch, but a man who had finally found his truth too late. Yet in that grief came renewal. The sight of William, Catherine, and Anne united beneath the same crest rekindled a fragile hope that the monarchy might still rise from its wounds, reshaped by the lessons of its own heartbreak. And as the cameras fade from the palace gates, one truth remains. This was not the end of the monarchy, but the rebirth of its legend. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.